Hi everyone, it's me, Emily, and today I will be talking to you about a comparative study, answering the question, how have the American news outlets CNN, NBC, and Fox News been coping with increased political polarization, as seen by the Capitol riot incident? As I said, the presentation is by me, Emily Ehrenreich. It's for the class CO 644, Crisis, Conflict, in Media, and the semester is spring 2024. Okay, so now we have a look at the table of contents. We begin with the introduction, which focuses on political polarization in the American society. Afterwards, we have a look at constructive journalism, with constructive journalism in the US and its shortcomings, especially one of the problems being the amount of people it reaches. Next is the news outlets themselves and an introduction to the news outlets that were mentioned in the research question, as well as a little bit about each of their political agendas. After that, we move on to the Capitol riots, explaining what happened at the Capitol riots and the effects this had on news media. Penultimately, we have a look at the analysis, which is the analysis of the reporting of the Capitol riots in the different news outlets, and see how this has led to the different news outlets coping with increased political polarization in different ways. Finally, we have a look at the conclusion, looking into summaries, limitations, improvements, and possible discussions. And here I would like to present to you one of the quotes that I came across in the research, which I thought was very poignant and super interesting to my research question. American politics today is characterized by a growing ideological polarization between the two major parties. This was said by Thomas E. Mann, who is an American political scientist. And here in the diagram, you can see the representation of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party kind of going up against each other head and head and showing contempt for one another. Now we start with the actual content of the presentation. As we'd seen in the table of contents, the first thing that we will be discussing is the introduction. This will be seen in terms of political polarization in the American society and what is meant by it. Okay, so now we have a look at political polarization. According to Priscilli, the dysfunction in American society is blamed on and explained by political polarization. But to understand it in context, we must first understand what it means. Political polarization is defined as the ideological convergence within parties and divergence between parties. This then goes into things like either political party being unable to carry out effective policymaking because they are blocked by the other side and their constituents. The effect this has on the citizens is also quite strong, and everything becomes a heated political debate. And this is a citation from Priscilli 2015. Okay, so now we have a look at American society and political polarization within it. And up here, interestingly enough, you can see a map of the United States in terms of voter constituents by party. So the dark blue is the Democratic Party, the red is the Republican Party, and then you've got lighter shades of each, which generally represent states that are leaning towards that party, and then you have purple in Florida and some other states, which are historically known as swing states. The polarization narrative began to be promulgated in the 1990s. By the mid-1990s, there was a culture war between the two parties that was perpetuated by political commentary and the advent of 24-hour news channels. Nothing showed this fundamental division better than the political map, which had been shown on the previous slide. For the most part, the two parties have mutual alienation and unforgiving contempt for each other. Popular polarization of the public was made worse by the media because they tried to justify people's voter patterns by generalizing them into broad categories that created an us versus them. And this can be seen in the political reference that is this picture, which is two battleships. One says Fox News and one says CNN. And this is like political commentary, sort of, in like a funny way, because Fox News and CNN in the US are very much known for usually having a rivalry and going head to head and generally despising each other. Now we move on to practical implications of this. One of the biggest problems with this is that this has led to a much more divided world. Politics and close political outcomes in terms of presidential elections have been known to showcase this, especially the 2016 presidential election in the United States. Trump won the Electoral College, but Hillary won the popular vote. And this is usually something in the United States political system that causes a lot of tension, because you would think that the candidate that wins the popular vote becomes the president, but the United States has an electoral college, so it's not necessarily based on the popular vote as much as it is based on how many electoral votes are assigned to which state. And this is why Trump ended up winning over Hillary. As had already been discussed, the height of this came, in the US at least, when former President Donald Trump was elected in 2016. People were either very much pro-Trump or they were for Hillary Clinton, which meant they were anti-Trump. The two camps could no longer agree on anything because either the constituents stood behind Trump or they stood behind Hillary. And since these two political candidates did not share very much of the same ideology and had very different ways of implementing policies and carrying out things, the voters themselves who stood behind these candidates also could no longer agree with one another. And for this reason, I also think that this image is very prominent again and very much fitting, with the red elephant representing the Republican Party and the blue donkey representing the Democratic Party, and them sort of going up against each other, having a rivalry and going head to head. Next, we get to the second point in our agenda, which was constructive journalism, especially constructive journalism in the United States and its shortcomings, one of which had already slightly been touched on, which is the limited reach in terms of audiences. We begin this by having a look at constructive solution-based journalism. So, constructive solution based journalism is a counterweight to polarization because if constructive solution based journalism is done right, it is meant to be neutral and offer solutions. And since one of the biggest problems in society, especially in American society, is political polarization and social polarization of any sort, the solution based journalism should try to create a neutral, safe space of sorts and not point the finger of blame in any direction, but rather tried to act as a counterweight to polarization. Um, the aim is that it does not create partisan issues, or if it does touch on partisan issues, it doesn't polarize any further. Instead, it is meant to create solutions that are beneficial to both sides of the political spectrum, namely both for Democrats and Republicans. So it should not have its own political opinion or a specific stance on any given topic. Instead, it should be instead of turning the polarized media landscape into a they say versus we say, they should try to find solutions based on compromise and neutrality. As far as this is possible, it will not always be possible, of course, but solutions based constructive journalism should at least try for this. However, this has become increasingly difficult in American society. I was going to say one of the reasons why, but it's more of a chicken and egg problem. But one of the actual dilemmas within American society is the lack of mainstream constructive news outlets, which on the one hand is probably because it's difficult and they don't have the reach that they should have, and even when they try to be neutral, there are very loud voices on either side of the political spectrum that are very much recreated in the media through echo chambers, which make it hard for the citizens of the public to listen to more neutral media. And yeah, that sort of becomes one of the main problems. Yes, so as I was saying, there are few large mainstream constructive news organizations within the US, especially in terms of trying to reduce political polarization, because that is a very hard task within American society. There is certain media, especially public media, that attempts to shy away from having a political orientation, but the public knows that even they have an ideology of sorts, even though they might not necessarily be as vocal about voicing it, they do still have one. No news outlet offers solutions to political polarization simply because I don't know if there are any solutions, especially given that the American society has sort of, in the last couple of years, turned to a point of no return, where I don't think any media outlets per se will be able to influence the degree of political polarization in terms of offering actual solutions for it, because as we will see later in the analysis, um, unfortunately, a lot of the time, the public associates these news outlets with increasing political polarization for a variety of reasons, which we will get into later. All polarized news outlets follow an agenda that spreads fear of some sort, whether it be fear of immigrants or the LGBTQ community, for more polarized news that is leaning more right wing, or fear of opposite views and fear of other political viewpoints, which is something that both the right wing and the left wing do because they like to point fingers at each other and say, oh, the other side is wrong. So there's always that problem as well. It is indeed hard to create constructive or solutions based journalism on a national scale, not just in the US, but in general. But in the US, this seems to be an even bigger problem. The media outlets are tailored toward audiences that have a certain opinion, and for this reason, people always find news outlets that are based in what they want to hear. The mainstream is simply too polarized to hear objective news, let alone anything that might be solutions oriented. We move into the third part from our agenda, which is the news outlets themselves. This covers a brief introduction to the news outlets as well as their political agenda. And we begin with CNN and its political agenda. CNN is also known as the cable news network and was TV's first 24 hours news service. It was founded by Ted Turner in the 1980s, and it is a subsidiary of Warner Media. The CNN headquarters are in Atlanta, Georgia, and the network is generally known for being liberal and left-leaning and having that sort of an agenda. As I'd already mentioned it earlier, it very much likes to go up against something that I will mention later, which is Fox News. One of the specific points here is the CNN effect, which CNN had a really big role in creating media and news that people talked about, and as it was one of the biggest news outlets. And for this reason, because it got so much public attention, citizens started to take the topics that were being covered seriously, and this led to the fact that things that were being discussed in the news actually made it into policy suggestions, both on a national level and an international level. And for this reason, the CNN effect sort of refers to the fact that news outlets, especially when the audience stands behind them, have the power to create public policy. And this is the logo of CNN. Now we look at NBC and its political agenda. So NBC is also known as the National Broadcasting Company, and it is the oldest broadcasting network within the United States. It was created in November 1926, originally broadcasting from New York City. It was an effort between the Radio Corporation of America, AT&T, and the Westinghouse Electric Company. On April 30th, 1939, NBC began a regular television service. In the 1990s, it established its presence on cable with news network shows such as CNBC and MSNBC. Though minimally left-leaning, NBC is considered a more neutral and unbiased source of political information in the United States. And here's the logo for MSNBC and the one for CNBC. Now we get to Fox News and its political agenda. So, Fox News is an American cable television news and political commentary channel. On this note, I have to highlight the fact that unlike the other two news outlets which we'd previously mentioned, there is a controversy about Fox News even by itself being a news outlet, just because while it does report a lot on news, it also offers a lot of political commentary, which is why I decided to include the fact that it was also a political commentary channel. And this isn't necessarily my own bias, it's also something that came up in the research. And this means that it's not just neutrally reporting on things, but that it is giving the perspectives of the reporters and the commentators. But this is something we'll get back into later. It was launched in 1996 under Rupert Murdoch's 21st Century Fox, which was formerly known as News Corp. And the original aim that Murdoch had was to purchase CNN, because he saw that CNN was doing well and he wanted some of that success for his own media empire. However, when Murdoch was unable to successfully purchase CNN, he wanted to create his own cable news channel that would be a rivalry towards CNN. And that's what he did. Roger Ailes, which I put this in brackets just because it was interesting to highlight. Roger Ailes, whether you know or not, is a former Republican political consultant. So this should already give you a little bit of an overview of the bias that Fox News will have. But as I said, we will get into this more later. Roger Ailes oversaw the new news network for Murdoch, and Fox News was known for having a strong political agenda, which I've already touched on a little bit, and it in its own words, is claiming to balance out the liberal media landscape. So it's trying to not necessarily just compete with the existing media, but it is trying to offer not necessarily counterfacts or alternative facts, because you got to be careful with that sort of phrasing, but it's trying to offer a different sort of perspective for the people of the public that aren't necessarily swayed or convinced by the more liberal media landscape. Fox News also has strong ties to the conservative political establishment, and namely the Republican Party. Now we get on to the fourth point, which is the Capitol riots themselves. Here we will look at what happened at the Capitol riots and the effects this had on the news in terms of media representation. The Capitol riots. Here you can see some images which I thought were very pertinent. The first one being the rioters on Capitol Hill and in front of the Capitol, which is not necessarily like actual pictures of the rioters, but more visual media and artwork in that sort of form. But you can also see a Confederate flag, because a lot of the rioters that showed up to the Capitol Hill on that day were they had very specific political ideologies. Some of them were anarchists, and many of them carried Confederate flags and believed in the Confederate state and those sorts of things that had been associated with that part and that time in history in the United States. Now we get into a little bit more depth about what happened at the Capitol riots. So, the Capitol riot attacks, which are also commonly referred to as January 6th or the U.S. Capitol attack, or a combination of these, was the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, 2021. This was undertaken by a lot of, as I'd already mentioned, anarchists, insurrectionists, and extreme right-wing groups and individuals. Groups included the Proud Boys, all those sorts of political groups and people who had similar ideologies, and then namely to say there was also a lot of individuals that didn't necessarily belong to any fringe extremist right-wing groups, but just shared that sort of ideology on the whole. But yeah, So it was pretty much about the fact that former President Donald Trump had encouraged his supporters to take back the vote, which was because he pretty much did not believe in the fact that he had lost the presidential election this time and that he would no longer be president for a second term. Um, and that President Biden had rightfully won. So on social media, specifically former President Trump made a lot of use of Twitter. He rallied together all of his supporters and encouraged them to attend protests and rallies and listen to the sort of speeches that he was giving. The former president was very clever about the fact that even though he incited all of these people who showed up to the U.S. Capitol riots, and ended up attacking the Capitol, the president or the former president himself was not anywhere to be seen necessarily. Sure, he had led like a protest earlier in the day, but it was far away from or relatively far away from the US Capitol, and also that's within his rights in terms of freedom of speech. However, he ended up encouraging his supporters so much that they ended up marching to Washington, D.C., and to the Capitol itself after having attended a lot of demonstrations and protests earlier in the day. And as I'd already mentioned a little bit, the goal was sort of taking over the Capitol in any way they could, and demanding that and taking charge and demanding that former Vice President Pence and the Congress retracted President Biden's electoral victory, which he won fair and square, but former President Donald Trump was unable to accept defeat. So he was trying to make out that he had lost unfairly and that President Biden wasn't actually meant to be president. And he was trying to polarize the public in that way. And unfortunately, he was able to polarize a lot of his supporters. And for this reason, because it will live on in infamy and be notorious for a long time, unfortunately, I put a calendar date of January 6th because this is what the Capitol riots were generally referred to. Like, you will often in the public and in media as well as in literature hear people refer to it as January 6th, for that was the date that it happened. This was actually the largest internal threat to American democracy in a very long time, with a coup taking place in the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, though, I'm pretty sure that former President Trump had planned this, there was little to no security present in or around the Congress, because it is actually publicly known that former President Trump had sent away many of the security members to other locations for events and all sorts of things on that day when he was planning to incite his followers to take over the Capitol. Additionally, the riot was broadcasted on all major news outlets, including the ones that have been mentioned in the research question and whose reporting on the event we will analyze later. It was the event and the happenings of January 6th were very unprecedented and very much happening at that moment in time, even though some people might have possibly foreseen that former President Trump was going to be unhappy with the fact that he was no longer going to be president for a second term. And that his supporters might feel outraged about this, especially when incited. No one could have predicted that it was going to go this far. Now we come to the reasons for the Capitol riots. The objective, as I'd already mentioned, was to stop President-elect Joe Biden from rightfully assuming his office. And the former president, President Trump, had rallied mobs of Republican insurrectionists through his Twitter page. And this generally came after former President Trump had claimed that the vote had been rigged and stolen from him, and that he should have been the righteous winner of the 2020 U.S. presidential election. As I'd already mentioned, Republican insurrectionists is one way of referring to these groups of people, but yes, there were also anarchists and people waving Confederate flags, and a lot of other fringe groups in society, such as the Proud Boys and other extreme right wing individuals and groups, which had been incited by Trump and had traveled to the Capitol to stop the steal, as former President Trump referred to it. And I don't know if the actual coup was planned, but all the individuals and groups that ended up coming to the Capitol riots originally had just sort of been in the area to attend protests and to listen to a speech that former President Donald Trump made earlier that day. On social media outlets as well as in traditional media, both of those outlets enhanced and spread disinformation that led to this event. Social media is very hard to filter, and traditional media has to try and keep up with social media and all the occurrences that are happening, but still, it is important that media generally fact check and try to report neutrally, or at least not to incite public outrage that would almost lead to the fall of the American democracy. So now we come to the outcomes of the Capitol riots. Here we can see a picture from the January 6th commission, which was a commission that was created in order to work out and sort of reflect on the things that happened during January 6th and prosecute those individuals that were deemed guilty and that had taken part that day. And then here's an actual picture of January 6th and the Capitol riots that took place. Now we get to some of the horrific and horrible tragedies and consequences of the things that happened as a result of the Capitol riots. Many officers were beaten brutally with deadly assault weapons and sprayed with chemical irritants, or crushed and trampled on accident or on purpose by the surging crowd. I know this might be a little controversial, and I will explain to you how I got this number in just a second. But according to the way I see it, 9 people died because of the occurrences that day. In a lot of the literature, you will find that that it will mostly say that like 3 or 4 people died during that actual day, which is true. Those 3 or 4 people died of dehydration, of being trampled, or heat stroke, having the negative impacts of that day during that time, and the fatalities that caused. However, the reason I say 9 people died is because in the aftermath of the Capitol riot attacks, there was a lot of, some of the police officers that were in the unfortunate situation of having to respond that day and having to respond to that incident and be there at the scene ended up not psychologically being able to deal with what they saw and what happened that day. So within a year of the Capitol riots, um, a number of policemen and security officers that were present that day unfortunately committed suicide. And this is something that is generally not mentioned in the literature. However, in one of the sources that I cited in my appendix, which we will have a look at later, and just in the citation list, as well as in the readings for further reference, you can see that there is one piece of literature that does give this information, which resonated with me because you can't just be looking at the immediate effects of it. You also sort of have to be looking into the long-term effects. And then in terms of actually reaching the Capitol and getting into the premise, protesters breached the premises and ran up the Capitol steps, scaled the wall of the West Terrace, and broke into the Capitol and looted and vandalized. And these were some of the more serious things that happened that day. Well, besides the insurrectionists fighting police officers and security and yes, posing an actual threat in a harmful, violent way. But in terms of actual occurrences in the escalation that led to them being inside of the Capitol, this is what happened. And some of the serious charges included that inside the Capitol they looted and vandalized and threatened a lot of the members of Congress. House and Senate members had to be evacuated. One of the results was actually that former President Donald Trump was banned from Twitter because of this incitement of the public and these fringe extremist groups, and that his impeachment process was started. And another outcome was that even though not all of the rioters and protesters were arrested, many of them were. Now we get to the Capitol riots and the news. Many journalists were there at the event, live at the scene. And this was really a large-scale news event. It was probably the most impactful thing to happen at least all year, and it was going to be something that carried a very controversial and complicated history with it, and had a lot of complex aftermath. But it was definitely large when it happened, but even larger in terms of consequences and how both the American public and the politicians chose to deal with it. As I'd already highlighted a little bit, this was a really complex and traumatizing time for very many because it was one of the days that America's democracy was actually legitimately threatened. And this reporting on such an event could make the career of a journalist. As horrible and cynical as that sounds, it was definitely an opportunity for journalists to both put their name out there and showcase the public what was going on that day. Journalists on the site were scared and shocked just like everyone else because, as I'd said, they themselves would never have been able to foresee this either, and they were just sort of there at that time and place, because I guess their editors or someone decided that something might happen, or that something was going to happen, but no one could have predicted this. There was a lot of live reporting, because especially at the time, the future of the event was unclear, because people really did not know what was going to happen next, what the consequences of this was going to be, how far the rioters and insurrectionists would take it, all of those sorts of aspects. There were many different types of reporters and news outlets present that day, with different takes on what had happened, based on political agenda and based on ideology and based on just personal interpretation, I guess. Okay, so now we get to point number 5 from our agenda, which was the analysis. Here we will be having a look at how the reporting of the Capitol riots in the different news outlets that were referred to in the research question and earlier in the presentation were undertaken, and analyze these in respect to how the news outlets decided to cope with increased political polarization. We begin with the reporting from CNN. So this was the news story that I chose in terms of the reporting of CNN, and it begins with a pull quote in the title, which says, "I wasn't sure if I was going home. U.S. Capitol Police officers continue to relive January 6th trauma in court." So this news reporting from CNN is based very much in the current times, and it sort of analyzes, it sort of looks at how the Capitol riots affected the people involved, including the police officers that were present that day, which is very much a human interest take on the story, which I am a fan of. That might be my own personal bias, but that's also just what the reporting out there from CNN was at the time when I made this presentation. And I think the pull quote in the title already is quite interesting, because it definitely shows that CNN has a very clear stance on this issue and all that happened that day. And for more analysis, we will look into the next slides. So we begin with analysis of the actual text. So, as I'd already said, there's a pull quote that's part of the title, which is very much attention grabbing and shows the seriousness of the topic. I don't necessarily want to say it's like attention seeking sensationalist journalism, because that's not really what CNN is, or at least that's not what it should be. However, it does do a really good job at portraying the seriousness of the situation and how grave the situation truly was. And while some people might interpret the pull quote in the title as being a little bit melodramatic, it definitely also showcases what the people felt that day and how earnest the whole situation was. Then there's also the fact that they used very strong diction choices in the article if you end up reading it. By the way, you can access the whole article because it's included in the sources at the end of the presentation, but I will point that out again when we get to the end of the presentation. So yes, diction choices. Diction choices that stood out to me while reading the article were the words like relived, trauma, endured, mob, and far right. These sorts of word choices definitely paint a very clear picture, and they showed the day in the light of the insurrectionists and the things that truly happened that day. They're not, I wouldn't say they're upplaying what happened, because it really was that dramatic, but they're definitely not downplaying it either. So they have a very clear view of this event and what happened and whether it was right or wrong, and they are not afraid to show this. Additionally, there is dramatic photography of all the events, or of the events that day, that continues to tell a story. Okay, so there's also the fact that, at least in this story, they're sort of advocating for justice, and the story centers around the fact that at least some sense of justice was served at the end, and it has the hope that people will learn from this. Um, the article itself tells an emotional story of how the country is trying to move past this tragic day in recent history and is trying to learn from it and move forward by discussing it in commissions and talking about it and reliving those traumatic events in courts, so justice can be found and then the country can move forward. And then you also see that the story shares the actual impact it had on many. And I remember the story was very emotive, and it focused very much on what are seen as the heroes of that day, which were the very brave police officers and the very brave security people who showed up and did their part to try and protect the country from this mob of insurrectionists. Now we move into looking at the ways that this news outlet portrays coping with this increased political polarization and any strategies that they have for it. So here in the diagram, you can kind of, again, I use a lot of the same imagery, so you probably got the hang of it by now, but you can kind of, again, see the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant in a divided gap, which is meant to signify polarization, sort of like yelling across it at each other, which is very much what's going on in the US at the moment, because the parties, instead of actually listening to one another, are just yelling at each other and blaming each other. So the CNN article was respectful of the defendants as it could be, which I thought was admirable because they definitely don't agree with what the defendants did, but they still want to show them decency and human respect, which is something that the other side might not necessarily do, but that's just my opinion. It also clearly shows that whatever people do and for whatever reason, that people's actions will always have consequences, which generally in life is a good lesson to learn no matter in what context. And it, even though in this story it was very specific to this context, it sort of is a forewarning to everyone. Especially in a politically polarized society. Um, it also specifically singled out guilty individuals and groups, which I thought was an interesting take on it because, I mean, I guess that's one way of making the guilty look guilty, but also of not overgeneralizing, because it would have been really easy for them just to say, oh, it's this group of people, it's all of them. Like, it's all the Republicans. They're all in the same boat. But that's not what they did. They pointed out, like, they named guilty individuals and, like, extremist groups where you already knew that, like, they were involved, and that's not news or really surprising, to be honest. But they could have said, oh, it was everyone of that party, of that belief, all that sort of thing, but they didn't. And I think that definitely signified the fact that they, due to some degree, respect the opposition at least, and try not to put everyone into the same shoebox. Then they also emphasized very heavily on the reporting of testimonials, especially those directly affected by it, which could have been very, this person said this, and it could have been dull and emotionless, and I all I almost want to say boring, but it definitely wasn't, because it was portrayed in such a relatable manner. And it was really clear for one, and it was really emotional, because it definitely gave that human connection, which made it a human interest story, to the reader, and showcased that the people that were involved in this on both sides were just people at the end of the day. They were trying to do what they thought was right. Um, and I mean, while in our society there definitely is a right and a wrong, and a hero and an anti hero in this sort of story, it also shows that everybody faces consequences for their actions, whether those actions be good or bad, and that even the heroes of this story, which, as the story presents it, are the police people, and the police officers. Those are, even they got consequences, because a lot of them were psychologically traumatized, or were injured during the riots, and all that just because they were standing up for their country in a brave and noble act, when it really should have never even come to this in the first place. But yeah, it also, with that, sort of showcases this very strong sense of political polarization that's already so engraved in American society, because it sort of depicts the police officers on the one side, and then the insurrectionists on the other. And as I'd already mentioned, that was sort of the height of political polarization in the US. But then also, the article is very careful not to polarize any further, which is why it didn't generalize, which is why it tried to portray things in a relatable manner, and nevertheless showcase that actions had consequences. So then we have a look at the fact that, as I'd already said, the Capitol riots were the ultimate culmination of what happens when there is polarization within a country, or even within, a society, and especially political polarization. And a lot of this can be led back to the fact that former President Donald Trump actively tried to encourage his supporters, his voters, his, I dare want to say fans, um, to rally and to make their voices heard. But also, he wasn't very much advocating for peaceful protests, as could have been the case. So a lot of those people that were attending those rallies were very much emotional and riled up, not necessarily out of fault of their own. Sure, they have their political opinion, and I definitely disagree with it, but they were so, brainwashed is the wrong word, that sounds horrible, but they were so exposed to an echo chamber, and only exposed to the thoughts of one another, and were so unwilling to even listen or consider the other side, that they just sort of, that their opinions radicalized. And ultimately, it wasn't former President Trump that incited all of this, that got the blame for this. It was the radicalized individuals that showed up to the protest and carried it out. not even, well, showed up to the protests for one, but then carried out the Capitol riots. And yes, they essentially, I'm not saying they were innocent, they were far from it, but they were manipulated into believing they could reform democracy, because in their eyes, as they had been told, democracy wasn't working, and it wasn't real democracy because the people that they were voting for weren't staying in office, so it must not be working. And that upset them, so they went out there and they did what they thought they could do to change that. And I'm not saying by any means that violence or attacking the Capitol is the way to go about it. There would have been very many different and a lot more peaceful means, but they thought that they did what was in their best interest, when they didn't realize that in actual fact they had been manipulated. And the article therefore also focused on the working man, which made the human interest story more relatable to people from the other side as well, because even though there is a lot of distrust towards the police, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not so good reasons, at the end of the day, the police is made up of hardworking, normal people who, for the most part, have the interest of protecting and serving the country. And the article sort of showed the impacts that they faced, which to some degree at least made the story more relatable, because the story could have focused on the impact the politicians faced, but then the story would have received a lot more backlash, because at the end of the day, normal people don't really care about the politicians that much, because they sort of, like, they're even less trusted than the police officers, because your average citizen would probably think that it's all the, like, political system and the politicians' fault that things even got this far, which, I mean, is one way of looking at it, because political polarization isn't possible without politicians. But that's a different story for a different day. And then this also creates sympathy among the general public, or at least to some degree, as I tried to explain, which has the aim of not polarizing, because if you would have made the story about, oh, those crazy insurrectionists, it would have definitely polarized, or if you would have made the story about the politicians, there would have been very strong opinions on that as well. So the story sort of tried to find middle ground, which they did by trying to represent the hardworking policemen that were standing up for democracy. They did this by more than just reporting on testimonials of affected politicians or other people. They had a good balance of testimonials of, like, the actual police officers, which obviously was very necessary, but they also looked into the causes of it and gave the whole story a more emotional aspect to it. Then here's the summary in terms of the analysis of the CNN reporting. So, to review, there was quotes in the text and in the title to try and resonate on a personal level with all the audiences, which again highlights the fact that they were trying to desperately reduce political polarization, and were also trying to address the other, like, people that wouldn't necessarily be their audience. They were trying to address people from the other side of the political spectrum who might have disagreed with what happened that day, and who had more, or at least slightly more moderate views. Nevertheless, there was also strong diction choices, which showcased both the fear and the chaos of that day. And I want to say that the strong diction choices could have gone either way, but in my personal opinion, I feel like they made the story more effective just because they were really good at showing the fear and the chaos and like the craziness of that day, but also just how unprecedented it was and how many actual serious real life consequences there would be following that day and how many there actually were and continue to be. Then it also tried to look at or tried to look for a meaningful way to move on without forgetting the tragedy. So while it obviously reminisced in the tragedy, it wasn't necessarily caught up in it to, oh, this is what happened and we're going to be talking about this for the rest of our lives, which yes, we absolutely should be, but we should also learn our lessons from what happened that day and then I don't want to say move on because move on is the wrong word, and we're not like, we don't want to forget about all the tragic things that happened that day and how American democracy was threatened, but we also, as a society, need to find a way to move forward. So it definitely singled out certain individuals rather than creating an us versus them, which is really important here because by singling out certain individuals, the article makes sure that like people know who is to blame. So they emphasize very much, oh, it was this individual did this, but they aren't gonna put this individual in with a bunch of other individuals who like were not necessarily part of it or not necessarily as actively involved and then say, oh, this group that did this, because that's not how it works and they don't want to polarize further. And if they had done that, it would have created very much an us versus them. It would have been like, oh, we the Democrats versus all those crazy insurrectionist Republicans, which is not the case. Not every Republican, not even most of the Republicans are crazy. Well, are no, are they're not crazy or insurrectionists, but they definitely like there are some bad apples no matter where you look. Democrats as well. So instead of just saying, oh, like this entire political party or whatever are is filled with bad apples, they were like, this one individual who chose to make a bad decision. And that's very much more valuable because it reduces political polarization and it sort of gives people a chance to actually listen to the story without immediately being offended. And it shows that actions, no matter how misguided, have real consequences. I'm not saying that, like, the people who carried out these things and who were involved in the Capitol riot were innocent. By no means, definitely not. And they definitely deserve, in the cases where they got punishment, they definitely deserve the punishment that they got. However, it's just the fact that they were seriously misguided because, as I'd already said, they thought they were doing the right thing because they were manipulated into believing that this was the only way that they were going to achieve what they what they were going for, which was in their eyes strengthening democracy. You can disagree with this very much, which I definitely do, but the I I want to say they were manipulated into believing this was the fact. Plus, like, I don't know, it must have been easy for them to just say, yes, this is how we feel. I don't think they necessarily thought it through. Versus the people at the top who incited this, they very much did think it through and they very much had an agenda behind what they were doing. But unfortunately, they were not the ones that ended up getting the consequences. Nevertheless, for your average person, it shows that actions, no matter how misguided, have real consequences. And the hope of the article is that ultimately there will be consequences for everyone involved. And it draws on the fact that, at least to some degree, justice is being served, because there are all these court hearings and commissions and things in place to keep America a stable democracy and to recount and reanalyze that dark day in history and think about what happened and like talk about it and like learn from it, because their ultimate aim is to not forget about it, obviously, and to commemorate it, but also just to close that chapter, to serve justice where justice needs to be served, which includes jail sentences for many, if not all, of the rioters, um, and then learning from this incident and teaching this incident, and then having a need to move forward and look forward. Now we start looking at the NBC reporting. The NBC reporting already is quite different, because while it also has a huge picture on its, like in the beginning, it has a very different sort of picture, because it's one individual up in a tree holding a Confederate flag. And the title reads, January 6th, the rioter with I Heart Trump hat and a Confederate flag gets prison for assault on officers. So, firstly, it definitely singles out one specific individual who clearly has a political affiliation. And also, word choice is important here, because while rioter still has a very much negative connotation, especially in the American context, it's not. There's a lot of harsher diction choices that could have been used that weren't. Um, and the picture itself is very captivating, because while there is a lot of chaos and things to be said about a like large group of people within a picture, focusing on one individual is a very effective choice here, just because all the attention goes towards this one person with the I Heart Trump hat and the Confederate flag, which is exactly what the title wants to be pointing out. And given that the person's also sitting in a tree, there could be a lot of interpretation about this, like that they're searching for freedom and all sorts of things, which is their like interpretation of what they were doing that day. Because I feel like for a lot of the insurrectionists, it was about freedom and like liberty and their basic First Amendment rights and all those sorts of, well, okay, First Amendment too, obviously, which is why they were carrying assault rifles, but just generally their constitutional rights, which is, I don't want to say it's an excuse for what they did. It definitely isn't, but it's an excuse that they use a lot. They're like, oh, we were protecting our rights. We were protecting our rights to bear arms. We were protecting our rights to protest, all that sort of thing, which is one take on it. And I think the photo, if you do some deeper interpretation, captures that really well. And then here it's too small now, but you can sort of see a little bit of the excerpt of the text. But as I said, there will be more analysis to come. So we have a look at the analysis of the text. So the text specifically identifies one individual by their accessories and the connotations this has, which is definitely very clear, because for one, with the I Heart Trump hat, there's very clear political connotations, because it's very much pro not just the Republican Party, but also pro President Trump, which not everyone in the Republican Party was, especially after his first term. And it also very much signifies, or is of is of importance that this individual was carrying a Confederate flag because, as I pointed out earlier at some point in the presentation, a Confederate flag obviously has very strong connotations as well, and I wanted, well, I'd hope at least for the majority of people also very like negative connotations because it's very much often associated with white supremacy, racism, and a slew of other very horrible things that most people would hopefully disagree with. Um, but nevertheless, the fact that the article chose to identify this individual based on these accessories highlights the fact that they will be telling the story of one person rather than a group of people are saying, oh, everyone who voted Trump or everyone who's a Republican is like this. Again, there's a slew of very strong diction choices, such as gets prison, assault, found guilty, attack, guilt, and all of these words all of these words and phrases tend to have negative connotations, which, yes, shows how grave the incident was and in what ways people are trying to move forward from it. And interestingly enough, the news story is indeed about one person's actions, but that in the context, in the larger context. And it additionally avoids generalizing language like the other article, just because generalizing language would increase political polarization, which is definitely also not an aim of this text. So there is definitely an objective account of the events and statistics involved in the event. And unlike the CNN article, there is much less emotive language used just because NBC is sort of trying to go for neutrality here as far as that is possible. It even tries to offer some sort of explanation as to why he participated in the Capitol riots and what motivated him. Not necessarily that the article is trying to justify what he did, I don't think that's it, but they're trying to make the other side, or make your average reader of, not even your average reader, because NBC is read by both Republicans and Democrats, but they're trying to convince the other side that definitely believe that the people that took part in the Capitol riots were all crazy insurrectionists and sort of definitely deserved the little punishment that they got. This article is trying to make them believe that in their own way they had reasons for doing this, and that much like in the previous article, it sort of highlights the fact that these individuals were misguided. And this article specifically highlights this even more. It talks about his family and how he'd been homeschooled and how, like, this echo chamber is ultimately what got to him, because interestingly enough, it also chose to focus on a young individual, which was a very interesting and bold choice, just because it could have gone either way. But focusing on a young individual, I feel like also to some degree tried to decrease political polarization, because there usually is so much, there's usually a stereotype about either side. So it's like, oh, these people belong to this side and these people belong to this side, versus if you, and a lot of the political polarization, unfortunately, in this day and age also comes from the younger generations. So if you pick an individual that is part of the younger generation, there's more relatability, and both sides can acknowledge, oh, this person could have been like me or is like me in some sort of way. We share some of the same experiences. And I feel like this definitely increases the relatability factor, which with their aim is to decrease political polarization. And interestingly enough, because it focuses on the story of this one individual in the larger context, it looks at both what his lawyers and the prosecutors say, which definitely, without getting too emotive, which definitely gives a overview of what is happening, but like in the most neutral way possible, just because even if what his lawyers said would have been biased in one direction or what the prosecutors say is biased in another direction, having both of those pieces of information presented means that there sort of is a neutrality or at least a balance because readers are hearing both sides of the story. So now again, we look into the ways that this media outlet is coping with the increased political polarization. So many of the January 6th rioters had been intentionally polarized by others, whether that be their friends and their family, as in the case with this individual, or by politicians, namely former President Trump and um, other politicians of that party at the time, or just like the society around you, or even just the media, because if you surround yourself by or with other individuals that think the same way, and then your whole social media becomes based on the algorithm becomes tailored that way, and then also the traditional media you choose to look at is obviously polarized because that's the media you choose to consume, then you will definitely be creating an echo chamber for yourself, which also politically polarizes you. The NBC article was very careful to not overgeneralize the defendants. So, as I'd already highlighted, it very much focused on the story of one individual, and it didn't say, oh, all individuals that took part in the Capitol riots were like this, but it chose to tell the story of one single person. And this was done obviously to avoid further polarization or disagreement, and also just to showcase that this was one possible scenario, but that this wasn't everyone's story. And there was also a lot of objective facts and little interpretation, which I personally thought was really good because it meant that there was a lot of neutrality, or at least a lot of this is the facts and we're going to listen to these facts. So it didn't give any audiences a chance to interpret anything or say, I agree with this, I disagree with this, which would have likely increased political polarization. But if you just present objective facts, everybody should be on the same page, no matter what their political affiliation is, or their train of thought, or their religiosity, or any of those other societal aspects. Um, there are also many direct quotes from both prosecutors and lawyers, which as goes back to the objective facts, because that's what happened, that's what was said, and um, yeah, I mean there might be some interpretation needed, but some things are always going to be needs to be interpreted at least to some degree. However, um, given that it showcases both quotes from the prosecutors and from his lawyers, suggests that they were definitely aiming for a degree of neutrality because they were looking to balance out the arguments. So the article focused on one person and the choices they made. dare I say, well, I mean, not even dare I say, the bad choices they made, but it focused on one person and the choices they made, which showed that, again, no matter what your reason is, actions have consequences. And I think this was also very apparent in this article, just because it sort of went into the life story of this individual and like explained what made this individual act this way. But nonetheless, even though the individual was young and was definitely manipulated and subject to outside influence, at the end of the day, he was over 21. So the actions and the decisions he made were all his own, and therefore they carried real life consequences. And the text managed to put these actions of one single person into a more generalized context of the trial outcomes, which was interesting because obviously this was a very unique story and it was very much focused on one person, but also it managed to put it into a context where this is what one person, like what led one person to doing this, and it might not be the same for everyone, it most likely isn't, but everyone ended up making the same or similar decisions. So now in the larger context of things, you have to look at what caused them to do this and whether they would react the same way again, and what consequences can be drawn from this. Now we look at the summary of this section and the analysis of the reporting summary. So, quotes and descriptions focusing on one individual made the story more personal, which was definitely of benefit because it tried to garner compassion and combined humanity that had the purpose of doing the opposite of whatever political polarization is. So, of trying to connect people and bring people together and make them realize that their differences aren't as strong as their similarities. It also had strong diction choices which showcased the severity of their actions, but for very much intended reasons. And it portrays both the guilt and the justification of unknowingness that the defendant has. So it definitely gives the defendant a personal touch and a backstory and tries to explain the reason this person turned out to be the way they were. It singles out a specific individual, creating an him versus us instead of us versus them. And if you focus it on one specific individual, then the chances that you're politically polarizing are much reduced. In actual fact, it's more likely that you're uniting people because you're creating a much larger in-group than you are creating an out-group. Sure, you're ostracizing that one individual, but you're doubling at least the size of the in-group. So it also showed that actions, no matter how misguided, have real consequences, which is something that we've already talked about a lot, so I will not repeat myself here. And it also manages to put the story of one person into the context of wider happenings and of what could possibly explain how many, if not all, the people that attended that day acted. So now we begin the analysis of the Fox News reporting. And you can already, obviously, I don't know how much you are familiar with the layout of Fox News, but you can very much already see the Fox News colors and the layout and Trump pointing his finger, but we will get to that picture in a second. I think the title is very interesting, for one, because the title says, Colorado woman dubbed January 6th praying grandma convicted of Capitol riot misdemeanors, Trump weighs in. So, first of all, you've got this Colorado woman, which is already like a relatively innocent phrasing, because all it says is that she's a woman and where she comes from, and it doesn't give any sort of nicknames or harsh criticisms towards her or any of that sort of thing. And then it says, dubbed January 6th praying grandma. So January 6th obviously refers to the day of the Capitol riots, and the public and Fox News and all the Republican individuals, I guess, decided to call this woman the praying grandma, which creates a sense of innocence almost, and of religiosity, because praying obviously is a very peaceful individual act of trying to find faith, and a grandma is something that's very personal and dear to all of us, and we all have one or had one at some point, and it creates this familial aspect and a lot more positive connotations. We think, oh, innocent, warm, loving, that sort of thing. And then you have the fact that it says convicted of Capitol riot misdemeanors. The fact that they called them misdemeanors instead of felonies or whatever already plays hugely into the fact that diction choices matter, because they're sort of downplaying the importance of what this woman did. And then lastly, you have the fact that former President Trump will weigh in, which is something that is very much associated with the Fox News reporting, because as I'd mentioned earlier, it's also very much a commentary channel, so they will try to get the opinions of people, which in this case I don't even think is as much of what they are aiming to do, but nevertheless they're trying to get someone's not expert, but expert opinion on the topic, because this is sort of the person that started it all. So they want to see how he sees the events that day and what happened and why this Colorado woman apparently is being convicted. And then here is an excerpt of the actual text, which we will also have a look at later. We come to analysis of the text. So, turning the tables around, this is almost as if the quotes intentionally use politically polarizing language, such as that used by Trump himself, referring to the praying grandma, which already is very much misinforming, if not polarizing language, as referring to her as one of the J6 hostages, which is an idea that he came up with, which J6 stands for January 6th, and Capitol riots, obviously. And hostages is a very weird way and very mind-boggling way of referring to the people that faced real legal repercussions as a result of heavily being involved in the January 6th Capitol riots. And in former President Trump's eyes, these are hostages because apparently they're innocent and they've done nothing wrong. But let's disagree with him here. So yes, and you have an image of him pointing the finger, which minus the background, it's the same image as used in the Fox News article, and that's one of his iconic is the wrong word, but it's one of his infamous stands where he's pointing the finger at someone, singling someone out, and has this really smug look on his face, and yeah. Anyway, so it changes the topic and it focuses very heavily on us patriots versus them crooks, which is something that Trump played into his entire administrative career and his electoral campaign, both the first time he ran and the second time that he attempted to run. And this is very much polarizing because it's us the patriots that love our country and like would do anything for our country versus them the crooks who are all corrupt and bad people. So it very much creates this dividing line, and it manages to portray the woman from Colorado, which for all intensive purposes will from now on be referred to as the praying grandma, not because I like the connotation or even agree with it, but just because it makes it easier. But yes, she is referred to and managed to portray as being the victim, and it ignores the existence of other people that don't fit the narrative. So people that don't fit their narrative are literally completely forgotten about. So it doesn't mention, the article barely mentions the politicians, it doesn't mention the police officers or any of the more violent insurrectionists. It heavily focuses on this one woman, and their ability to portray her as a victim when that's really not what she was. I mean, sure, she might not have been as violent or insurrectionist as some of the other people that attended the coup, but nevertheless, she was there. She breached the premises and she did all of those things. She's responsible for her own actions, and therefore, she should also be responsible for facing the consequences of these. It highlights one specific person again, which is something that a lot of the articles have had in common so far, and it uses some objective language, or at least it tries to use objective language, but we will get to this point in a second. But it definitely has a very clear political agenda, and anyone with half an ability to critically think or analyze things will figure this out relatively soon. So, diction choices that are used include capital riots, praying grandma, small business owner, J6, and patriotic. So, as you can see, compared to the other two articles, the language use has very much changed. Because, first of all, they called them the Capitol riots, which, okay, I mean, sure, I've been referring to them as this as well throughout a lot of the presentation. However, they could also be called Capitol attacks or something that has a more negative connotation. And then we've got our praying grandma, who apparently in their eyes is this cute old innocent lady from somewhere Colorado that like has done absolutely nothing wrong. And small business owner, I think that in the text is used to also refer to her, so the praying grandma, which again gives this idea of, oh, hardworking citizen that is being exploited by the capitalist system and like has done nothing wrong, is only trying to go about her life and like do things that make her happy. And then J6 is an abbreviation for January 6th, but J6 sort of takes the seriousness out of the January 6th Capitol riots, which I thought was a very interesting take on it, because there was definitely someone behind that idea that came up with it and was like, oh, that's one way in which we can hide the seriousness of what happened. And then you've got phrases like patriotic, which patriotic is very much heavily ingrained in this like ideal of the American society, and both Fox News and former President Trump play very much off of this ideal. So it's very much a positive thing, and that's what everyone aspires to be, sort of. Then the article itself has very much a sympathetic tone towards the praying grandma, and leans into these all-American values like God in terms of religiosity, patriotism, family, country, those sorts of things. And it is seeking understanding for the woman who, at least in my interpretation, sort of, even given the quotes from her in the article, seems to see herself as a martyr, which is mind-boggling and baffling at the very least, but what can you do? Okay. Now we look into the ways that Fox News has been coping with the increased political polarization. So, for one, Trump continues to politically polarize and spew misinformation on which some news outlets, i.e., namely Fox News at the time, reported on. And the Fox News article was carefully crafted to reverse the narrative because it is very hard work to manipulate the reader, and somehow they have managed to spin the narrative in such a way that your politically inclined reader will believe that this is the take on what happened and that's really how it went, when there's a lot of manipulation and like twisting of facts. And this is done with the intention of uniquely further polarizing, which is definitely not something that should be an aim of a news outlet at all, full stop, but also just specifically given how dire the situation in America already is, should not be a goal of anyone. But nevertheless, their purpose is to create further political polarization. And this is done by the distortion of facts and managing to show the perpetrator as the victim, which invokes sympathy within the audience. It highlights the all-American ideals and manages to proclaim the innocence of the praying grandma. And here is a picture of Trump and Murdoch, and here's another picture of Trump and Murdoch. Okay, so make of those images of Trump and Murdoch what you will. I am not here to tell you how to think or give you my spin on things, but just think about it. Anyway, moving on. We see that the article focused on one person and the choices they made, which is something that it has in common with the NBC article, and to some degree also has in common with the CNN article that focused on one specific group of people. And it showed that in their eyes, actions often have unjustly consequences. So this is sort of reversing the narrative that was told both in the CNN and NBC stories, where it emphasized the fact that actions, whether good or bad, misguided or not, always have consequences, versus here it very much highlights the fact that they believe these actions often have unjustly consequences, and that if people didn't do anything wrong, which is their belief of what happened that day, I guess, then they shouldn't have to face consequences. So they're sort of advocating for the fact that consequences shouldn't exist, especially if people did nothing wrong. And it intentionally polarizes by having a political objective, which, for more detail on the political objectives, see some of the previous slides. And now we have a look into the summary. So quotes and descriptions focusing on this one individual, i.e. the praying grandma, make the story a lot more personal, and specifically dubbing her with such innocence in using words like praying grandma and small business owner to characterize her, make the audience feel sympathy. And yes, so the strong diction choices, instead of showing fear and chaos like they did in the other articles, are very much used to put on this theater show of trying to proclaim the innocence of the defendant, i.e., this Colorado praying grandma woman. And it intentionally polarizes to achieve obvious political objectives, but hides it well enough that some people might not notice, which I found very interesting because they so blatantly manipulate their readers, but they also so blatantly don't want their readers to know that they are being manipulated, so they try and do a really good job of hiding it. It singles out specific individuals, which we've already covered, and this manages to create solidarity in terms of us patriots versus them crooks. So it creates very much an us versus them and a clear in group, out group. And if you're not part of the in group, you're corrupt or crooked or something negative. So yes, it does a very good job at reversing the narrative, and it shows that they believe that our court system accuses the innocent, because they think that they did nothing wrong. So why would they be accused? And it highlights this polarization and aims to increase it through misinformation and the reversing of facts. So it creates doubt in our court systems. It creates doubt in consequences of actions and the legality of things. And it tries to downplay the significance of what happened that day and what the Capitol rioters and insurrectionists actually did. Now we get to the sixth and final point, which is the conclusion. So this has a look at summaries, limitations, improvements, takeaways, and discussion questions. The first thing we'll look at in terms of this is the main takeaways. The Capitol riot and its reporting shows that the three news outlets clearly have very different agendas and political agendas at that, and that these inherent agendas make their coverage of the events match their outlook. So only to a very limited degree is any of the news outlets even trying to be neutral. The one that does the best job of this is NBC because it has the most moderate political agenda. But both CNN and Fox News have very clear outlooks and very clear ways of representing things to match their political agenda. And CNN and NBC try to reduce the levels of political polarization by at least to some degree treading lightly because they don't want to make the situation worse for the American public. Yes, and then here you can see the differentiation between the three news outlets. So NBC, i.e. in this case MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News. Okay, so NBC acts as a minimalistically center-left counterbalance to CNN and Fox News, and it does so for a variety of reasons that we've already mentioned, because it has the least drastic political agenda, at least from my point of view. While CNN avoids political polarization, it does still manage to portray a very clear right versus wrong, and they are clearly right, and someone else, i.e., people on the other side of the political spectrum, are clearly wrong, which is something that a lot of people will agree with, but also that to some degree also creates political polarization because it says, oh, because the in group is, oh, we're right, we're the ones that are in the know, and then the wrong is the out group, and this creation of in group out group leads to increased political polarization, even if this isn't necessarily their intention. Fox News is largely just unaffected by the increased political polarization and pretty much continues to do its own thing, doing whatever is beneficial to them at that moment. Yeah, so it aims to increase political polarization as long as it benefits them. So now we move on to the limitations and improvements. The Capitol riots happened relatively recently, and it is still relevant, which is obviously a very positive thing. However, this also means that we don't know the future effects of how these events will turn out and how the future generations will see these events. Ultimately, this also means that my research is a snapshot of this specific moment in time. And as much as I try to stay unbiased, there is definitely a side I agree with and one that I do not. This project does not have the scope to look at all the possible implications of the Capitol riots or of the analysis of the different types of reporting, because otherwise this video would have been even longer. Things might continue to unfold in the future because we simply cannot look into the future and we will not know. This is just one of the recent events that highlights political polarization, and there are a number of other events that have highlighted political polarization, but I chose to pick this one. And now we get to the actual conclusion. So, political polarization continues to play a really large part of society and a really important role within it. With everything they publish, news outlets, whether it be the three that are mentioned in the research question or alternative news outlets, must decide if they want to try and minimize this divide of political polarization, if they simply want to accommodate the other side. So, not even to look into their point of view, but just be like, oh, the other side has a point. This is what they're saying. They might as well be right. Or if they actively want to feed into it. And I have tried to portray the analysis in such a way that the news outlets have very different agendas and to some degree feed into all of these categories. So journalists should, from my perspective at least, stay objective and not point fingers. But they should also not shy away from reporting the truth. And here are some discussion questions that you can go home and reflect about. So, how do you think journalists should deal with political polarization? That's one very insightful question, and this presentation has tried to answer it, but ultimately this is up to you and what you think about it. And then the other question is, can you think of a topic that showcases political polarization in your home country? Because in the US, Capitol riots is just one example, and also not everyone is from the US. Make it personal to you and where you're from, so you really understand the importance of this message and the importance of how political polarization plays such a deep role in entrenching the divides of our societies. Okay, so if you've been interested by my presentation and are interested in doing any further readings, in the following pages I have additional reading lists that are separated by topic. So firstly, we've got publications and interesting things about the political scientist Thomas E. Mann, from which I gave a quote at the very beginning of the presentation. Then here's a little bit more publications and information in case you're interested in political polarization, especially within the US. As well as constructive journalism in America, or in the United States, I should say, just for clarification. And then more publications about CNN, as well as the CNN effect, in case you're interested in reading up on that. And here also at the bottom it says the article and the citation of the article that I chose to analyze, so you can go back and read the original article in case you're interested. Now here's some more information and publications that looked into NBC. And here also, I've done it again. I've included the analyzed article. So in case you're interested and you want to go back and read about the rioter with the I Heart Trump hat and the Confederate flag, here's your chance. And then here's a lot of publications and other additional information from literary sources and across the web that look into Fox News. And there's also additional information on the Fox News factor, which I have not managed to look into that much in this presentation, but is definitely something for people that are interested in terms of extended reading, just because I did not have the time to cover everything in this presentation, and this presentation is already really long. But yes, here's also the analyzed article, so if you want to go read up on the praying grandma and get your thoughts on if you think this article is politically motivated, here is your chance. And then everything about the 2021 Capitol riots. And congratulations, you have made it. We're at the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening. But don't go anywhere quite yet. In case you have any questions, put them in the comments below, and I will try to answer them. Also, here's a list of an alphabetical list of the APA 7 references used in this presentation just for academic purposes. So in case you want to have access to it, here you go. And finally, please be aware that I have no rights to the images that I used, and that if you wish to use them, you should please contact the authors of these images. Thank you for listening and enjoy your day.